Focus of this assignment is Civil War, start to Juneteenth. You're going to have a series of tasks that you have to complete with questions. These are the terms you need to know by the end of this particular class, and you want to use the framework sources to complete this particular sheet, looking for a definition, summary, and the possible significance. The themes addressed are outlined right here. We're going to start out this session looking at the Seneca Falls, which was the birthplace of the women's rights movement, which was led by Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They would write their Declaration of Sentiments, which would outline the ideas of the Declaration of Independence and some of the ideals that the country was founded on at the American Revolution. Why are we starting with this section? When we look at this timeline, we see the history of these two movements pretty much side by side in the 1800s, where the slave convention is taking place. The two women are told that they cannot speak about women's rights at a slave convention, so they decide that at Seneca Falls they're going to start their own movement. And this is going to be problematic because what you're going to find is as the freed male slave becomes free and gets the right to vote through the 15th Amendment, it's sort of like he passes white women. And white women are going to be a little bit upset about this since they've been protesting since Seneca Falls. Even Abigail Adams would write to her husband when he was negotiating to create the country. And the story is that he could all but laugh at her request to include anything about women's rights in any of the documentation. So that's the reason why we're looking at these two movements. Here's a more of a recent article that references Donald Trump here, and it's looking at that particular issue where Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony are looking at these two issues where white women are kind of upset about the ability to elevate the freed slave, who was initially somebody who was viewed to be as inferior. So if you're saying that the slave was inferior and now you are saying that the slave is free and can vote, well then what are you saying about women? With the Civil War, we've already looked at this particular image. The CSA, or the Confederacy, Confederate States of America, is going to leave. There's a debate about why the Civil War was fought. Was it to end slavery? Was it because the South left the Union? And that's the argument that's pretty much made. I mean, if it's to end slavery, the South is leaving because of the federal government's stance on slavery. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg, which came first type thing. This war is going to start off with the Fort Sumter debacle, which is considered the first shot of the Civil War, even though some people also like to look at Bleeding Kansas, but that's more of a political issue. But the story here is that Fort Sumter is a federal government, it's a military base that is located physically in the South, and that the federal government is trying to resupply Fort Sumter. If the South agrees to the shipment of military goods, then it's sort of like the Confederacy acknowledging that they are still part of the South. Doesn't end up that way. Shots are fired, and this is confirmation that the South wants nothing to do with the North. When we look at the decision by the South to leave the Union, with this map we want to focus primarily on the border states, because remember, the South considers itself to be a separate country, the Confederate States of America. In this particular document, Lincoln is going to issue his Emancipation Proclamation, which is viewed as a document that frees the slave, as he kind of outlines that particular issue right here. The problem is, this map is further looking at the Emancipation Proclamation, and what you want to focus on here is that Lincoln is trying to free the slaves, but he's freeing the slaves here. The problem is that this is considered the separate country, the CSA. There's a debate about whether or not Lincoln does this because he's trying to keep these border states from joining the Confederacy. In other words, if he bans slavery everywhere, then that might prompt these three states to join the Confederacy, at which point he's trying to maintain their allegiance to the North. These two slides were used in a prior slideshow. We're looking at the Missouri Compromise Line and then the Underground Railroad. And we already talked about Harriet Tubman leading a raid during the Civil War as a result of her understanding of geography and terrain through the Underground Railroad. We're also looking at African Americans during the Civil War. And as you see some of these yellow highlighted items, you want to treat these like definitions or data points. And the question here is, what exactly did slaves do, freed slaves do, during the Civil War? So here we have a photograph which acts as confirmation that we do have freed slaves participating in this particular fight. In this image, we are looking at African American record of military service. So here we're looking at the Union Army, the Union Navy, and black enlistment in those military institutions. This is an image from the AP framework. It is a photograph, a washerwoman for the Union Army. So it's looking at not only the role of men, but also the role of women as they help to contribute during the Civil War. Here we have a required document, The Colored Soldier by Paul Lawrence Dunbar. And what it's looking at is the participation of the African American, if we want to use that term, during the Civil War. Here it's looking at all of the contributions during this particular conflict and arguing that their contribution was one that was great, that ultimately led to the success of the North winning this particular conflict. You are required to have an understanding of this particular source. We then transition to the end of the Civil War with Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War where the South was going to be rebuilt. If you've never seen this map before, the South was cut into 5 military districts. And these military districts, pretty much like an occupation of the South. And it was viewed as an example of the federal government trying to abuse the power of the state governments, which would be crucial during the Reconstruction unit later on in the course. 3 amendments are passed during this era, the 13th, 14th through 15th Amendment. 13th frees the slaves. 15th Amendment guarantees the right to vote, which is what I said before. This one is definitely going to be concerning for white women because you've elevated the status of the now freed slave by guaranteeing the right to vote. And then the 14th Amendment, which addresses the issue of equal protection that states cannot deny. A required source is General Order Number 3. General Order Number 3 is a proclamation from the United States that all slaves are free. So I guess this supersedes the Emancipation Proclamation. And this is going to lead to a question about what is going to happen at the end. The freed are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. Well, how is that going to actually change their situation? That will be something addressed during Reconstruction. So now I want you to think about the question here. The Civil War is over. Like, what happens in this scenario? The year is 1865. The 13th Amendment is passed, and you are now free. Here we have the passage, the text of that particular piece of legislation. And the concern, this is what you need to think about. As a former slave, what is your immediate concern? Write down 2 below. Do not list under items 1 and 2 below. So I want you to think about what is going to be your immediate concern. And then here is a list of historic concerns. How would you answer the questions below? I don't know if in the prior slides you thought about them. For example, this question here, if all you knew was to grow cotton, what are you going to do? Go back to growing cotton? Do you own any land? Do you have any resources? So you want to think about these particular questions. Did you lose any family due to death or sale? If family members were sold, are you going to try to find them back? Find them. Below is a list of historic concerns held by former slave masters. How do you think they answered these questions? Now, this is looking at it from the other point of view. For example, what do you do here If your slave now, your former slave, refuses to work beyond 8 hours, remember we were talking about working up from sun up to sundown, and now you don't have to follow those particular orders. Working with a team of legislatures, develop a proposal at the end of the Civil War that is designed to end slavery. And what we're trying to think about here is this chart. What would be your short-term, long-term action? What resources will you need? And what is your justification? So what you want to think about here is, what are you going to do? For example, if the slaves, let's say 40% of them can only work with cotton, are you going to provide any sort of land? Are you going to provide some sort of immediate training? So we can put like immediate training here, long-term action, I don't know, land every 5 years, depending on whether or not you stay there. And then what resources will the government need? All of these things are going to cost money. So as we transition into the Reconstruction section, we want to have an understanding of what the federal government, the state governments are doing now that 4 million people are about to be free. This section right here is looking at the guaranteeing of rights and how will you change the perception of white Americans throughout the South who want the Southern way of life to be implemented again. In other words, these individuals, what they want is home rule. They do not want to be told by the government what to do. They want to be able to control their own situation, which was why those military districts were so important. And these are going to be an issue of contention as we transition to Reconstruction. The last images from the AP framework are these images of celebrations from 2019 and 2021 of Juneteenth, which references this particular document, which frees the slaves, as we mentioned before. At the end of this class, you should have some understanding of these terms right here. And hopefully you completed the sources from the worksheet within the framework. And if you're unsure of the definitions, here they are.